Hi, this is Paula Gloria, and this show is called Farther Down the Rabbit Hole. Today we have one of our older guests, special guests. He's been on the show many times, and that's Dr. J.J. Hurtak. We've done many shows in the past on the Shroud of Turin, and I've also on these shows have included some roll-ins from people who for decades now have been focusing on the science behind this very fascinating document of higher potential. So welcome, Dr. Hurtak.
It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, I just kind of want to catch you up. Since we've been working together on the Shroud, I've posted those shows on the internet, and I've gotten hundreds of responses from all over the world. And people, it inspires them that life is so much greater than what it seems to be, or that our average education indicates that it is. And since you and I have been working together for so long, since that time I've also run across a book by Tony Bushby, I think his name is, called The Crucifixion of Truth. And I showed you this book and asked what your thoughts were on it, to see if we could kind of make deeper some of the work that we've done in the past with the Shroud. So he was saying that this book is, that in the book of Crucifixion of Truth, he was citing many examples of forgery in the Bible. The fact that there have been mistranslations, there have been omissions, there have been additions, and in the midst of all of this, which seems to be a study of heartbreak almost, because he's so almost of the opinion that the entire process has been one of just bamboozling the public. Yet I knew in the middle, when he talked about the Shroud, that the carbon dating that he cited was not accurate. So that's just an example that I thought we could kind of start into this discussion, however you want it to go.
I'd like to say at the outset, it's been my privilege to work with great scholars throughout the world. In my earlier work in linguistics and the translation of ancient texts, I had the opportunity to work with Catholic, Protestant, Jewish scholars, Buddhist scholars, those of the Eastern traditions, and as a presenter at the World Parliament of Religions, I've had the opportunity to present many of the newly translated Nag Hammadi texts, or the Coptic texts from Egypt of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century, that I think show great light and relevance on the whole controversy regarding the Shroud, namely that the Coptic Christians in the 2nd century acknowledged that there was a vesture of glory, vesture of light connected with the whole story of Jesus and the process of his death and his resurrection. I think this is so important because the arguments that pick up on the Shroud that Bushby and others speak about come in from the interpretation of the medieval period, some of what he considers to be the hoaxing by the official ecclesiastics of the Western Church of the so-called Shroud, but the whole drama of what the Pistis Sophia literature speaks of, which is the wisdom literature of the Coptic Church, is that all life is the descent of the soul into this life, and when we find our energy of self-realization, that creates, as it were, the garment of light, the light body. In the poetry, the shroud, or the garment or vesture of light that allows us to experience the higher worlds. And so the classical arguments against, as it were, the New Testament account of Jesus and the whole drama of his birth, his death, and his resurrection must be seen in terms of a much larger tradition of light body teaching, and not be localized according to the pros and cons of what some of the more recent polemicists have brought into the foreground.
Well, can you explain polemicist, the word? I don't know what that word means.
Polemicists would be those who would argue on the basis of traditional arguments that we have only one tradition, the so-called textus receptus, the received text only of the New Testament or the Old Testament. We only one figure known as the historic Jesus as opposed to the cosmic Christ.
Right.
We have only one type of paradigm, which is the male-oriented paradigm of the Western Church, overlooking the fact that in the Eastern Church, in the African Church, the role of the female is equal to that of the male. In my book called The Book of Knowledge, Keys of Enoch, which I published in 1973,
should we come in on that?
We can have the camera come in. I have a plate. If we look here to where my...
Maybe just move it, yeah, a little this way.
Thumb is indicated at the top of the page. We see three major traditions. We see on the far side the rabbinic tradition, in the middle of the apocalyptic Jewish tradition that eventuates into the New Testament, and on the far side, which would be my right, we see the higher Gnostic and the pre-Christ tradition of wisdom literature, exemplified in the teachings of the Far East, the Jewish communities in exile, and even what is called the pre-Jesus Christ Gnosticism, which means the teaching of the light body. All of these eventuate into the Gospel of Thomas, the lost teachings that we find now being found throughout the Middle East, which shows a much larger panorama of teaching, a much larger tradition of the whole concept of the ascent and the descent of the soul into this physical reality. And so if we are going to use Bushby's title, The Crucifixion of Truth, we must also look at the greater drama that world history basically has excluded all of these other essential texts. And if we look, for example, at the wisdom traditions, we will see that the pre-existent figure of the heavenly man or heavenly woman is, in essence, a type of Christ motif, a Christ symbol in the heavens that reflects humanity that must rise beyond the crucified experience of our daily life. For we, in this world, according to the wisdom tradition, are crucified to our body when we are born. Our body is our walking cross. And as we take our consciousness off the cross through self-realization, we realize the Christ drama to be connected with the cosmic Christ, not simply the story of the historic Jesus, who is but one of many representatives of this greater story. So it's not a question of forgery or counterfeiting, it's a question of misreading the larger library of the ancients that Mr. Busby and others like him are creating, to say this is simply a two-dimensional drama of the Western Church versus the Judaic traditions. We're looking at an avalanche of new documents, fantastic documents, which Dr. Kurt
But
Rudolph...
just a second. They wouldn't really be new documents if they're in the basements of the Vatican. He was claiming that there was a lot of juggling around of manuscripts, and I mean, I think even Dr. Michal Ledwith, the star on What the Bleep Do We Know, said that if you got the key into the secret basement, you would just be so bewildered because it's just like miles and miles of all of these books and you know, crumbly pages. So it's not even that somebody's trying to deceive, but that although Bushby does make a good argument for deception, but that the volume now is so huge, how do we sort our way through it? And you were talking about the crucifixion being something that can inspire us in our daily life. So that implies to me there's something practical about your teaching, which is also very esoteric. You know, how do you bring it in the Academy of Future Sciences when someone comes to study with you, because I know you have thousands of students throughout the world? What do you hope to give your students that helps them where this isn't just a story, whether there was an historical Jesus or whether he was all of these teachings are an expression of a great body of knowledge, some of which have come to the light of the masses and some of which have been hidden. So you see what I'm saying? Whether Bushby is even questioning whether there was a Jesus, and you're talking about a body of knowledge that says there is a science of developing our potential, and he hasn't been the only one.
No, I think your questions are very good. They're very right on. And in the context of Dr. Kurt Rudolph, whose name I'm mentioning with his book called Gnosis,
Which means knowledge, right?
Which means knowledge. There is a map of the world showing all of the other libraries. I know it's difficult for the television audience to see this, but if the camera can focus on, we see from where my fingers are pointing to the areas of Central Asia, the Taklamakan Basin, as it is known to geologists, all the way across.
You want to point? I'll hold it. You can point.
This area to the far east, the gates of China, all across the Pamir watershed to the Ural and Caspian Sea in southern Russia, across to the Black Sea area and the areas of the Holy Land, and then of course into Europe proper. There is a vast panorama of many, many libraries. So again, it's not the question of the Vatican holding the key. That is the wrong paradigm. You might say that all cultures have had, as it were, their own sacred collection of books. But in the process, in Western religions, particularly the three religions of Abraham, the tradition has been to emphasize the father figure to the exclusion of the mother figure. And with the avalanche of documents now coming out by archaeologists, linguists, orientalists, and remote sensing individuals such as myself, we've had the opportunity to take radar into the Middle East, to go under the sands of Egypt, to go into the areas of Syria and southern Russia and locate these other libraries, which changes the whole complex of the polemicists who want to argue either geopolitically something on the basis of the Catholic Church controlling everything, or the Jewish Church controlling something. We're looking at a much larger picture that is going back hundreds, if not at least 1,000 years earlier, showing that there is a much greater drama that's going to change the basis of Western religion.
Now, could this have something to do with those who have the wisdom being concerned that it not be misused, that they hide it? Like even right now, you're citing areas that there's huge warfare going on right now. And I think in Iraq, libraries, museums have been destroyed. You know, it goes in the face of a lot of conventions that I think Eleanor Roosevelt in her time, they tried to set up to protect these historical legacies that all of humanity shares. Are you implying that these libraries throughout the ages have had books of
precious
documents about the soul's development that have been hidden when the raiders would come through, the armies would come through and destroy everything?
In some areas, this was done particularly by certain Coptic and Abyssinian or Ethiopic Christians to avoid, as it were, periods of political mismanagement or religious repression. Certain monastic communities did hide these documents. In 1945 to 47, we found over 54 documents in Upper Egypt, next to where the great tombs of the dynastic period of Egypt
is that
located. That's the Nag Hammadi, the small community where it was found.
Right.
And what I'm saying to our audience is we must fasten our seatbelts and realize that we are living in a fantastic period of time where we're seeing, as it were, the libraries, which are the backdoor to the Old Testament being open. We're seeing a much greater teaching of what the ancients referred to as the man-God partnership, of the heavenly man, the heavenly woman, that would have the ability to come down through the whole process we call incarnation or biogenesis, through the body of light, to give teaching of enlightenment or self-realization or liberation to humanity, and then leave behind, as it were, the garment or some aspect or artifact of the greater journey of the soul back into the greater universe. So what I'm saying is we've got now the scientific tools from the other countries to see this as a much larger drama than simply the Judaic versus the Catholic versus the Protestant, all which are looking at simply a male-orientated tradition rather than the larger wisdom traditions that are changing everything phenomenally.
You know, it just occurs to me as you're presenting all of this, if someone was to say, oh, the gullible masses have been deceived, and yet one person or whoever, you think when I say one, usually someone that focuses more than social mediocrity allows, to reveal a greater understanding, could either step up to the plate and say, oh, you have doctored these, you've mistranslated, you've added this, you've omitted this, or they could just sort of say, I have realized what the truth is, and I'm going to live a little more quietly and not rock the boat. You know, you might have two different types, because clearly Bushby, at least when I read it, he convinced me of a lot of mischief that's been done. But I also felt that to have that kind of energy around is constructive. Have somebody who will investigate, will look at things really deeply, and then take something like the Shroud that's had documentaries done on it, and we've done many shows. They're old by now, but time keeps marching on, and we should be able to have intellectual freedom to discuss this if we have a difference of opinion, to have a nice environment in which to exchange our differences. Because someone told me that Bushby is running for his life. He's because what he's saying is so flies in the face of convention.
Well, I have translated many of the documents he's referring to, and I can assure you they're not all in the Vatican library or basement. The so-called Sibylline oracles, or the Sibylloi as they're called in Greek, were well known to many of the libraries of Central Asia and the East. I had the opportunity at the University of Chicago and other great universities to read many of these documents that he's referring to. So it is clearly an important time that we're living in, recognizing that before the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, there was a much larger ecumenical side to the Judeo-Christian wisdom tradition. And to follow up on your earlier question, through a higher positive psychology, a higher positive understanding of brotherhood and sisterhood, we can bring about a consciousness synergy through which we can cooperate. Through that tradition, which the ancient mystics referred to, that of the Divine Mother, whether it was in the Sanskrit tradition of Imma, or the Hebraic of Shekinah, or in the Greek Coptic Parthenos, with the male traditions, because ultimately in a new world that's evolving, we need to see a common consensus, not simply a ritual or a dogma, but we need to see a deeper story, which is the finding of the light body within each of us that comes through unconditional love and surrender to the divine. The process of utilizing the paraphysical gifts of the Spirit, which is bringing about these paranormal, paraphysical, meaning transcending the physical three-dimensional dimension, through which we begin to understand the greater energy of life. Some would call this the energy plenum of the universe, the background energy through which life goes on and repatterns itself into an infinite way, an infinite mind, an infinite specieshood. This greater process, I believe, can come constructively out of these new books, no matter how...
New books or old books?
New books. Like the author that you're referring to in the Crucifixion of Truth.
Oh, right.
Through proper scholarship, through proper dialogue, we must see the advantages of living in a world where the speeding up of knowledge and opportunities of sharing far offset the traditions of putting things into the hands of the few and ignoring as ancient lost books to the many.
Well, he's definitely throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, he's been disappointed by many things he's discovered. And like I'm saying, the Shroud was just one tiny aspect of that book, but I thought if you could illustrate to him that the scientific evidence that he's citing that this is a forgery because the carbon dating was wrong, if the man who invented carbon dating said it wasn't an accurate test, then maybe in reconsidering that, there could be a whole different way of looking at the data that he's assembled or the way he's interpreted. But it seems at a certain point, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. And I'd asked you before, a student who comes to study at the Academy of Future Sciences, what would he gain? And now I have an example from my YouTube posting, some very touching responses that I've gotten from people who've been students of yours, who've studied the Keys of Enoch. And I'm very convinced by what they said about the positive effect that this knowledge had on their life. So I know that esoteric teachings, I don't know if you like that word, but teachings of the paranormal are very practical, because when people are hopeless, despondent, in despair, they're not going to be productive. On the other hand, the argument of Bushby and others would be, if you've got your head in the clouds about other dimensions and you're being bamboozled on this dimension, how can that really be stable?
Again, we have to go beyond conspiracy mentality when we approach the wisdom traditions, because they are vast.
But you can acknowledge that there is conspiracy.
Of course,
Okay,
every
fine.
tradition has its own, as it were, priestcraft, priesthood, and general orientation of how it has served a particular line of teachings,
Well, the line of
concepts.
But does it really serve the wisdom tradition?
Well, that's the point I'm making through my research and participating with the Parliament of World Religions. We live in a time where we must take consciousness off a linear path of space and time and recognize that the whole human consciousness, the global consciousness, is accelerating in finding a greater library of teaching from the ancients, be it in the deserts of the Taklamakan Basin, the Gobi in China, or the deserts of Egypt. We're beginning to realize that there's a whole backdoor to human civilization, and that backdoor shows us that the earlier teachings of Christianity, in particular with the discussion we're having today, shows that early Christianity in Africa was far more scientific, parapsychological, and female in its orientation than Bushby and others would have us believe by looking simply at traditions that were anti-feministic that came in much later. The earlier documents of the Coptic Church are fantastic examples of a greater ecumenical love story of God that is being shown in greater traditional synthesis.
Now, an ecumenical love story of God, that means consciousness affecting the world?
Yes.
Now, that, to me, when I went to India and studied the Divine Mother for 4 years, it was about the 5 elements, it was God coming from nature, and also explaining the power behind the miracles, that there's a real science to it. But at the same time, I am very attracted to thinkers like Bushby who question it, because I find those that believe in miracles too easily aren't any closer to really making it happen than those who disbelieve, who, if you sat down in a rational way, if you could present them with the evidence, would be more capable of the ecumenical love story moving through their life.
Well, Bushby, if you read him carefully, is criticizing the New Testament and questioning the authenticity of a Jesus figure
Right.
that then is, in a sense, associated with the Christ teaching in terms of an artificial construct. I mean, I can understand this from the standpoint of secular scholarship.
Because you've been there, right?
I've been
as a scholar.
there. But having had a higher consciousness experience of seeing momentarily the energy body of the Christ figure, I can argue definitely that on a paraphysical level, there is a greater consciousness in the greater universe that is able to penetrate the 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional realities of who we are in this limited evolutionary time frame we call life on planet Earth in the 21st century. We are being presently, if you can talk about this in the context of the new astronomy cosmology, perhaps we can look about this in other venues, being shown magnificent documentation of ultra-terrestrial intelligence.
What?
Ultra-terrestrial intelligence.
Ultra?
Intelligence that is far more evolved on the evolutionary scheme of things, that is able to interpenetrate and connect with the human race at this time in planetary history.
Now, is that something you would have believed in before you had this experience, or is it something that you naturally grew to understand because of this higher unfolding?
In the latter.
The latter.
Yes.
So what I would hope to do with you in the time to come, when we have more shows, is not only understand more this higher state of consciousness experience that you had, but if there are indeed ways that every viewer, whether they're skeptical or whether they're believing, are actually participating in this, because that must be the vision that you had, that all of humanity would move together.
If I can just quote
Sure.
briefly from the Pistis Sophia, from the Greek and the Coptic text, Reading now from a teaching of the disciples of the Jesus of Nazareth figure being quoted. It occurred then that after the sun arose in the east, that through the first mystery which had existed from the beginning, for whose sake everything had come into being, and out of which I have just now come, not prior to my crucifixion, but now it occurred through the command of that mystery that my vesture of light, my garment of light, according to the Jesus narrator here, should be sent, which from the beginning it had been given to me, and which I had left behind in the last mystery, namely the 24th mystery, counting from the innermost out these mysteries, which are from the orders of the second space of the first mystery. This is esoteric science, where Jesus is explaining that what he's shown to his disciples in a body of light, in the body of his resurrection, is something that transcends our rational understanding. He's also saying that as a carbon-based humanity, there is a point to which all of us will pass through where our body can manifest itself into a higher state of glory. Some would call it a superluminal energy bursts. My friend at Jet Propulsion Lab,
We only
Don
have 30
Lynn,
seconds.
when he transcribed the image enhancement data, said that there seemed to have been a tremendous energy radiation or burst out of the shroud. I believe that this historic witness of the Coptic texts shows clearly that the early church in Africa and Egypt knew about the shroud even before the politicians arrived on the scene in the Middle Ages. May we be blessed and may we go forth with spiritual freedom and understanding in this age of ecumenical love.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, J.J. Hurtak. And thank you for joining me. I'm Paula Gloria. This is Farther Down the Rabbit Hole. I look forward to many more opportunities to explore this very profound topic about our potential and how we can achieve our highest potential. I would encourage you to look up the Academy for Future Sciences, and I believe the pistasophia.org.
Yes, pistasophia.org, which means faith and wisdom.
Right, faith and wisdom. So thank you so much.
And we thank all of our audience. Keep love in your hearts. Keep a smile looking to the heavens.